Hello, my dear friends, take a slow breath. Tonight we are not here to shock or rush. We are here to gently explore a quiet and often misunderstood part of the past. Imagine yourself stepping back many centuries into a medieval world where life moved slowly, knowledge was limited, and many parts of human experience were shaped by tradition, belief, and silence. This is not a story of excitement. It is a story of rules, expectations, and daily reality. In medieval times, topics related to intimacy were rarely spoken about openly. There were no guides, no open conversations, and no shared understanding in the way we know today. Most people learned about relationships not through discussion, but through observation, custom, and instruction from elders or religious teachings. Silence surrounded the subject, making it feel heavy and serious rather than personal or emotional. For many, it was something that happened because it was expected, not because it was understood. Marriage was the center of intimate life. Love, as we imagine it today, was not always the main reason people married. Marriages were often arranged by families to secure land, safety, or social position. Because of this, closeness between two people often developed slowly, if at all. Many couples met only shortly before marriage, sometimes for the first time on the wedding day itself. Emotional connection was not guaranteed, and comfort took time to grow, if it grew at all. Religion played a powerful role in shaping how people thought about the body and relationships. Many teachings focused on control, discipline, and duty. Pleasure was rarely discussed and often viewed with suspicion. Intimate life was framed as something serious and purposeful, tied closely to family and continuation rather than enjoyment. These beliefs influenced how people felt, how they behaved, and even how they thought about themselves. Privacy was also very limited. Homes were small. Families often shared sleeping spaces. Curtains, locks, and private rooms were rare. Because of this, many moments that we now consider private were instead surrounded by others. This lack of privacy added to discomfort and awkwardness, making closeness feel rushed or tense rather than calm and personal. For women especially, expectations were strict. Their role was clearly defined by society. Knowledge about their own bodies was limited, and decisions were often made for them. Fear, uncertainty, and silence shaped much of their experience. Men, too, were guided by rules and pressure, expected to fulfill duties without guidance or understanding. Everyone was following a system they did not fully question, because questioning was rarely allowed. As you imagine this world, notice how different it feels. There is no openness here, no shared language for feelings, no gentle learning. Just tradition, belief, and expectation, passed down quietly from one generation to the next. As the night grows calm, let this first image settle softly in your mind. There is no need to analyze it. Simply let it be. In the next part, we will slowly move into how everyday life, health, and misunderstanding shaped intimate experiences even more deeply. For now, remain still. Let the quiet continue. Let rest deepen naturally. In medieval times, intimacy was rarely about romance or personal desire. For most people, it existed inside marriage, and marriage itself was not usually a choice made by the couple. Families arranged unions based on land, work, alliances, or survival. Love was not expected at the beginning. It was something that might grow later, slowly, or sometimes not at all. Because of this, physical closeness often felt like a duty rather than an expression of feeling. It was part of adult life, accepted quietly and rarely discussed openly. Religious belief shaped nearly every part of private life. The church taught that physical intimacy had a purpose, and that purpose was not pleasure. It was order, responsibility, and family continuation. Many people grew up hearing sermons and lessons that framed the body as something to control rather than enjoy. Because of this, expectations were narrow and carefully defined. Certain days were avoided, certain times of year were restricted. Even within marriage, there were many rules about when closeness was considered acceptable. This created an atmosphere where intimacy felt serious and regulated, rather than free or spontaneous. For women especially, expectations were heavy and often silent. From a young age, they were taught modesty and obedience. Knowledge about the body was limited, passed quietly from older women rather than explained openly. Fear and uncertainty were common at the beginning of marriage, not because of drama, but because of unfamiliarity. There was little preparation beyond simple advice to endure and behave correctly. Emotional comfort was rarely discussed, and personal boundaries were not a common concept. What mattered most was fulfilling one's role properly. Men, too, lived under strong expectations. They were taught responsibility, control, and authority within the household. Emotional closeness was not encouraged openly. Expression was restrained. Even when affection existed, it was shown through action rather than words. This made intimacy quiet and restrained, shaped more by routine than conversation. Silence often surrounded these moments, not because of shame alone, but because there were no words for private experiences in a world where privacy itself was limited. Living spaces also influenced everything. Most medieval homes were small, crowded, and shared. Privacy was rare. Beds were often shared with children or other family members nearby. This meant that physical closeness had to fit into practical realities. Moments were brief, quiet, and shaped by circumstance. There was no separation between public and private life the way there is today. Everything existed close together, and this closeness changed how people experienced their bodies and relationships. Over time, many couples adapted. Familiarity replaced fear. Routine replaced uncertainty. Intimacy became another part of daily life like work or meals. Not exciting, not discussed, but accepted. For some, affection grew slowly through shared hardship and time. For others, life remained practical and emotionally distant. Both experiences existed side by side in the medieval world. As the night grows quieter now, let this image soften. This was a world where intimacy was shaped by duty, belief, and survival, rather than choice or freedom. In the next part, we will gently explore how health, childbirth, and limited knowledge shaped these experiences even further. Always slowly, always calmly. For now, remain still. Let the quiet settle, let rest continue gently without effort. In the medieval world, most intimate life existed inside marriage, not because of romance, but because of structure and survival. Marriage was less about personal desire and more about family, land, alliances, and stability. When two people were brought together, they were expected to create a household that worked. Affection might grow later, but it was not required at the beginning. Intimacy was often seen as a responsibility, rather than an expression of love. For many couples, closeness happened quietly without discussion, guided by tradition and expectation instead of conversation. The idea of privacy was very different from today. Homes were small, rooms were shared, and families often slept close together. Because of this, intimate moments were brief and practical. There was little space for exploration or comfort. Silence was important. Discretion mattered more than pleasure. The body learned to be quiet, both physically and emotionally. Intimacy fit into daily life the same way other tasks did, without ceremony, without language to describe feelings. Religion shaped expectations deeply. Church teachings influenced how people thought about the body and desire. Pleasure was rarely discussed openly. Intimacy was framed as acceptable mainly for creating children. Enjoyment was not celebrated, and sometimes it was quietly discouraged. This created a sense of distance between people and their own bodies. Many learned to separate physical closeness from emotional connection, treating it as something necessary but not deeply meaningful. For women especially, expectations were heavy. Their role was tied closely to marriage and childbirth. Choice was limited. Conversations about desire were rare or non-existent. What mattered most was fulfilling a role within the household. This did not always mean a life without tenderness, but tenderness was often quiet, unspoken, and shaped by duty rather than freedom. Men also lived within expectations. Strength, control, and responsibility were emphasized. Emotional expression was limited. Intimacy was not a space for vulnerability, but another part of adult life that followed rules. Many couples learned closeness slowly over years, through shared hardship rather than shared words. As you imagine this world, notice how calm and restrained it feels. Intimacy existed, but it was quiet, structured, and shaped by society rather than personal exploration. This is an important part of understanding what sex was really like in medieval times. It was not dramatic or openly discussed. It was woven silently into daily life. As the night grows quiet now, let this picture soften and fade. You do not need to think about it further. Let your body remain still. Let your breathing stay slow and easy. Allow rest to continue gently, without effort. Just as the story continues in its own time. In medieval times, intimacy was deeply tied to marriage, not to romance or personal choice in the way we think of it today. For most people, marriage was arranged by families, shaped by land, work, alliances, or survival. Love was not expected to come first. Sometimes it came later, slowly, quietly, or not at all. Because of this, sexual life inside marriage was often seen less as a private emotional experience and more as a duty, something that belonged to the structure of life rather than to personal desire. This made intimacy feel routine, predictable, and sometimes distant. The medieval home offered little privacy. Families lived close together, often in one or two rooms. Beds were shared, sometimes with children or other relatives nearby. Curtains or screens might offer minimal separation, but silence was difficult to find. Because of this, intimacy happened quietly, carefully, and often quickly. There was little space for exploration or comfort. The body adapted to these limits, and expectations adjusted accordingly. Sex was something done, not something discussed or reflected on. Religion played a powerful role in shaping these expectations. The church taught that intimacy was acceptable mainly for reproduction. Pleasure was rarely spoken of openly and was often treated with suspicion. Many believed that enjoying intimacy too much could lead to moral weakness. Certain days were forbidden, such as religious holidays, fasting periods, or times of prayer. This created a calendar that quietly controlled when intimacy could happen, further turning it into a regulated part of life rather than a spontaneous one. Women in particular carried a heavy burden of expectation. They were taught obedience and modesty from a young age. Their role was to maintain the household, bear children, and support the family structure. Their comfort or desire was rarely considered important. Pregnancy was frequent and dangerous, and recovery time was limited. Despite this, intimacy was still expected to continue, because producing heirs and maintaining marriage obligations mattered more than physical or emotional well-being. Men also lived under expectations, though of a different kind. Masculinity was tied to strength, control, and duty. Emotional expression was limited. Many men were taught little about tenderness or communication. Intimacy was often approached practically, without guidance or shared understanding. This lack of knowledge made many experiences awkward, confusing, or emotionally empty, even within marriage. As you imagine this quiet, constrained world, notice how different it feels from modern ideas of intimacy. There is no drama here, no excitement, no open conversation. Just routine, silence, and expectation woven into daily life. This is why intimacy in medieval times often felt heavy rather than joyful, shaped more by survival and structure than by connection. As the night grows quieter, allow this image to soften and drift away. You do not need to hold on to it. Let your body remain still. Let your breathing slow naturally. Let rest continue gently, without effort. In medieval times, intimacy was deeply tied to marriage. Not romance in the way we understand it today, but duty, order, and social structure. Most people did not marry because they felt drawn to one another in a personal way. Marriage was arranged or strongly guided by family, land, trade, or survival. Because of this, intimacy was often approached as an obligation rather than a shared emotional experience. Husbands and wives entered marriage with clear expectations placed on them by society, religion, and tradition, long before they understood each other as individuals. This shaped how closeness was experienced, often making it quiet, formal, and emotionally distant. For many women, intimacy was something expected rather than chosen. From a young age, they were taught that marriage meant obedience, patience, and acceptance. Their role was defined clearly, and questioning it was rare. Emotional preparation was minimal. There were no open conversations, no guidance focused on comfort or understanding. Everything was learned through experience, often slowly and silently. Because of this, intimacy was rarely discussed openly, even between spouses. It became something that happened without words, without explanation, and without reflection. Men, too, were shaped by expectation rather than understanding. They were taught about duty, control, and responsibility, not emotional connection. Vulnerability was discouraged. Showing tenderness was not emphasized, especially among working and lower classes. As a result, intimacy often lacked softness. It followed routine rather than feeling. This does not mean affection never existed, but it was not the center of the experience. Survival, work, and social order always came first. Religion played a constant role in shaping these moments. The church taught that intimacy was allowed only within marriage, and primarily for reproduction. Pleasure was rarely discussed openly, and often viewed with suspicion. Because of this, many people carried quiet guilt or confusion, unsure of what was permitted and what was not. This made intimacy something private and restrained, surrounded by rules rather than curiosity. As you imagine this world, notice how different it feels from modern expectations. There is little talk, little exploration, and little emotional preparation. Everything is shaped by duty and silence. This is one of the reasons why intimacy in medieval times felt limited and restrained. Not because people lacked feeling, but because society did not give them space to explore it. As the night grows quieter, allow this image to soften and fade. You do not need to hold on to it. Let your breathing slow. Let your body remain still. Let rest continue gently, without effort, in its own time. In medieval times, most intimate relationships existed inside marriage. But marriage itself was very different from what we imagine today. It was rarely about romance or emotional connection. Instead, it was seen as a duty, a social arrangement that helped families survive, pass on land, and continue bloodlines. For many people, especially women, intimacy was not something chosen freely. It was something expected, tied closely to responsibility rather than desire. This shaped how people experienced closeness, often making it feel quiet, controlled, and serious rather than personal or expressive. The church played a strong role in shaping these expectations. Religious teachings often described intimacy as something allowed only for reproduction. Pleasure was rarely discussed openly and was sometimes viewed with suspicion. This created a heavy sense of restraint around physical closeness. People were taught that desire should be limited, controlled, and never spoken about freely. Because of this, many couples entered marriage with little understanding of their own bodies or emotions. Intimacy happened, but often without guidance, comfort, or open communication. For women, this experience was especially difficult. A wife was expected to fulfill her role quietly and without complaint. Saying no was often not considered an option. Marriage gave a husband legal and social authority, and this power imbalance shaped every part of domestic life. Emotional needs were rarely acknowledged. Physical discomfort was often ignored. Intimacy became something endured rather than shared. This reality was common and rarely questioned because it was deeply rooted in social and religious beliefs. Men, too, were shaped by these expectations. They were taught that intimacy was a responsibility tied to lineage and honor. Emotional closeness was not encouraged. Vulnerability was discouraged. Many men lacked the language to express care or gentleness, even if they felt it internally. As a result, intimacy often remained distant and formal, shaped more by rules than by connection. Privacy was also limited. Many families lived in small homes with shared spaces. Beds were sometimes shared with children or relatives. This lack of privacy added to the awkwardness and restraint surrounding intimacy. Moments of closeness were brief and carefully hidden. There was little room for exploration or comfort. Everything about the experience felt rushed, quiet, and constrained by circumstance. As you imagine this part of medieval life, notice how different it feels from modern expectations. There is no celebration of closeness here, no open conversation, no shared understanding. Intimacy existed, but it was wrapped tightly in duty, silence, and obligation. This is another reason why physical relationships in medieval times were often confusing, uncomfortable, and emotionally distant. As the night grows quieter now, allow this image to soften and fade. You do not need to carry it with you. Let your body remain still. Let your breathing stay slow and easy. Allow rest to continue gently, without effort, just as the story pauses here. In medieval times, one of the most important things shaping intimate life was not romance or desire, but space. Or more accurately, the lack of it. Most people lived in small homes with very few rooms. Families slept together. Children, parents, sometimes grandparents, all shared the same space. In villages, walls were thin, and sounds traveled easily. Because of this, privacy as we understand it today barely existed. Intimacy did not happen behind closed doors with quiet music and soft lighting. It happened carefully, quietly, and often with great awareness of others nearby. This lack of privacy changed everything. People learned to be discreet, not expressive. There was no open discussion, no exploration, and very little freedom to experiment. Intimacy became something brief and practical, shaped by the need to avoid attention. Silence mattered. Timing mattered. The night was often chosen not because it felt romantic, but because it offered the best chance of being unnoticed. Even then, complete privacy was rare, and this created a sense of tension around intimate moments rather than comfort. Married couples often shared their sleeping space with others. A bed might be shared with children or servants. In some homes, people slept on the floor nearby. This meant that intimacy had to fit into very narrow windows of opportunity. Many couples waited until others were asleep, or until the house was empty for short periods. These limitations made intimacy feel rushed and restricted, not relaxed or emotionally open. Because of this, physical closeness was often separated from emotional closeness. Feelings were rarely expressed openly. There were no long conversations about desires or needs. Silence surrounded the topic. What little people knew came from tradition, religion, and observation rather than discussion. This silence created confusion and misunderstanding, especially for young people entering marriage with little preparation. The shared nature of medieval living spaces also meant that intimacy was closely connected to duty rather than pleasure. It was something to be done correctly and quietly, not something to be explored. The body was present, but the mind stayed guarded. This shaped how people experienced closeness, often making it feel distant or uncomfortable rather than warm. As you imagine this world, notice how different it feels from modern expectations. There is no sense of privacy, no personal space, and no freedom to relax fully. This is another reason why intimacy in medieval times was often tense, limited, and shaped more by circumstance than choice. As the night grows quiet now, allow this image to soften and fade. You do not need to hold on to it. Let your body remain still. Let your breathing slow naturally. Allow rest to continue gently without effort. In the medieval world, privacy was rare, and this shaped intimacy in quiet but powerful ways. Most people lived in small homes shared with family, servants, or animals, all under the same roof. Walls were thin, rooms were few, and personal space barely existed. Because of this, intimacy often happened quietly and quickly, shaped by the need not to be heard. There were no locked doors, no separate bedrooms designed for couples, and no expectation that private moments would be protected. This lack of privacy did not remove intimacy, but it changed its rhythm. Touch and closeness were woven into everyday life rather than set apart from it, and silence became an important part of connection. Intimacy in this setting was less about long preparation and more about shared understanding. Couples learned to communicate without words, using routine, timing, and familiarity. Nightfall brought darkness that offered a small sense of protection, and people waited for moments when others slept deeply or were occupied elsewhere. These conditions made intimacy feel grounded and practical rather than dramatic. It was shaped by circumstance, not fantasy, and this practicality influenced how people experienced closeness with one another. The emotional side of intimacy was also influenced by this shared living. Because couples were rarely alone, emotional closeness often developed through daily cooperation rather than private conversation. Working together, sharing meals, and managing household tasks created bonds that supported physical closeness later. Intimacy grew slowly, built on routine and trust rather than secrecy or excitement. This made relationships feel steady, even when they lacked romance as we imagine it today. Silence played a gentle role in these moments. Quiet was not just about avoiding attention, but about presence. In the stillness of night, with little light and few distractions, people focused more on sensation and closeness. Without music, artificial light, or constant noise, awareness stayed close to the body and the moment. This simplicity made intimacy feel calm and grounded, even when conditions were not comfortable. As you imagine this quiet closeness, notice how different it feels from modern ideas. There is no performance, no expectation to impress, and no outside influence shaping desire. Intimacy existed as part of life, not as entertainment or identity. It was something people returned to naturally, shaped by routine, trust, and the rhythm of the household. As the night grows quiet now, let this image soften and fade. You do not need to hold on to it. Let your breathing remain slow. Let your body stay relaxed. Allow rest to continue gently, without effort, just as the night continues on its own. In medieval times, one of the most difficult parts of intimate life was not emotion or desire, but privacy. Most people lived in small homes with many family members sharing the same space. Beds were often shared, rooms were few, and walls were thin or sometimes did not exist at all. Because of this, intimacy was rarely private in the way we understand it today. Instead, it was quiet, careful, and often rushed. People learned to lower their voices, to wait for the right moment, and to accept that complete privacy was almost impossible. This constant awareness shaped how intimacy was experienced, making it less about expression and more about discretion. Silence played a large role. Talking openly about intimate matters was discouraged, especially for women. Knowledge was passed quietly, often through older women, or through observation rather than explanation. Many entered marriage with very limited understanding of what to expect. This created confusion, fear, and sometimes discomfort, especially in early married life. There were no open conversations, no shared language to describe feelings, and no guidance focused on comfort or emotional connection. Intimacy existed, but it was surrounded by uncertainty and restraint. The church's influence added another layer of silence. Religious teachings emphasized modesty, control, and restraint. Intimate life was framed as something serious and regulated, not something openly discussed or explored. Certain days were forbidden, certain behaviors discouraged, and moral expectations were always present in the background. Even within marriage, people were encouraged to be reserved. Pleasure was rarely spoken of openly. Instead, intimacy was viewed as part of duty and order, something that fit into life quietly rather than standing out. For many, this meant that emotional closeness developed slowly, if at all. Affection was often shown through daily acts rather than words or touch. Sharing work, surviving hardship together, and raising children side by side created bonds that were deep but understated. Intimacy became woven into the rhythm of daily life, not separated from it. It was quiet, ordinary, and often unremarked upon. As you imagine this world, notice how different it feels from modern ideas of intimacy. There is no openness, no clear guidance, and very little privacy. This is another reason why intimate life in medieval times was shaped more by circumstance and silence than by choice or expression. As the night grows calm again, allow this image to soften and fade. Let the thoughts settle gently. There is nothing to hold on to, nothing to solve, just quiet understanding, drifting slowly into rest. By the time we reach this part of the story, it becomes clear that sex in medieval times was surrounded by far more silence than freedom. It was not a topic spoken about openly, shared casually, or explored for curiosity. Instead, it existed quietly within strict rules shaped by religion, community pressure, and fear of judgment. Most people learned about it indirectly, through observation, tradition, or whispered advice passed down quietly between generations. There were no clear explanations, no open discussions, and no guidance meant to comfort or educate. What people knew came from custom, not understanding. For married couples, intimacy was often treated as a duty rather than a source of closeness. Marriage itself was less about romance and more about survival, family alliances, and social stability. Emotional connection was not the main focus. Intimacy happened within a narrow set of expectations, often tied closely to reproduction. Pleasure was rarely discussed, and sometimes actively discouraged. Many believed that too much enjoyment was sinful, distracting, or morally dangerous. Because of this, physical closeness often felt restrained, rushed, or emotionally distant rather than warm or expressive. Religion played a quiet but constant role in shaping these attitudes. Certain days were considered inappropriate for intimacy, including religious holidays, fasting periods, and even specific times of the week. People were taught to feel guilt easily, even when following the rules of marriage. This created a complicated inner world where natural feelings existed alongside fear of moral failure. Many lived with a sense of confusion, unsure whether what they felt was allowed, forgiven, or condemned. Privacy itself was rare. Homes were small. Beds were often shared with children or relatives. Walls were thin. Silence was necessary. This lack of privacy shaped behavior, making intimacy something carefully hidden rather than naturally expressed. Even married couples had limited opportunities to be alone, which added to the sense that physical closeness was something secretive rather than open and accepted. For those outside marriage, the risks were far greater. Social punishment, shame, and loss of reputation were constant threats. Women, in particular, carried heavier consequences. Their behavior was closely watched, judged, and controlled. This imbalance created fear rather than safety, and caution rather than trust. Relationships were shaped more by survival than choice. Over time, this environment shaped how people felt about their own bodies. Curiosity was discouraged. Questions were left unanswered. The body became something to control rather than understand. This separation between natural feeling and social expectation created quiet tension that followed people throughout their lives. As you imagine this world, notice how quiet it feels. Not dramatic, not shocking, just restrained, controlled, and emotionally distant. This is what intimacy often felt like in medieval times. Not wild or free, but limited, watched, and shaped by rules that left little room for comfort or expression. As the night grows quieter now, allow these thoughts to soften and fade. You do not need to hold on to them. Let the story rest. Let your body remain still. Let your breathing stay slow and gentle. Allow rest to continue naturally, without effort or expectation. In medieval times, one of the most important things to understand is how little people actually spoke openly about intimacy. Imagine living in a world where almost everything about the body was wrapped in silence. There were no open conversations, no shared advice between friends, and no clear guidance given with kindness. Most people learned what they knew through observation, rumor, or quiet instruction that was passed down without explanation. This silence shaped how people felt about their own bodies, often creating confusion rather than comfort. Religion played a strong role in this silence. The church spoke often about morality, duty, and control, but rarely about understanding or care. Physical closeness was usually described as something serious, heavy, and connected to responsibility rather than pleasure. Because of this, many people carried feelings of worry or guilt, even within marriage. These feelings were not loud or dramatic. They sat quietly in the background of daily life, shaping thoughts and emotions without being questioned. For women especially, this silence could feel isolating. Expectations were placed on them without clear explanation. They were told how they should behave, but not why they felt the way they did. There was little space for curiosity or comfort. Feelings were something to manage quietly, not discuss. This made emotional connection difficult, even between married partners. Many relationships followed rules rather than understanding. Men also lived under pressure, though it was expressed differently. Strength, control, and responsibility were expected, while vulnerability was discouraged. This created distance rather than closeness. When emotions were not shared, relationships often became formal and restrained. Warmth existed, but it was limited by custom and fear of doing something wrong. As you imagine this world of silence, notice how heavy it feels without being dramatic. It is not loud suffering, but quiet confusion. This is an important part of understanding medieval intimacy. It was shaped not just by actions, but by what was never said, never explained, and never gently understood. As the night grows quiet again, allow this image to soften and fade. You do not need to hold on to it. Let your breathing stay slow. Let your body remain still. Allow rest to continue calmly, without effort. In medieval times, one of the most important things to understand about intimacy is how little it was spoken about openly. Sex was not discussed in clear words, not explained carefully, and not taught gently. Instead, it existed inside silence. Imagine growing up in a world where no one explains what your body is for, where questions are discouraged, and where curiosity is often met with shame or fear. Most people entered adulthood with very little understanding of intimacy. What they learned came slowly, quietly, and often with confusion. This silence shaped how people experienced closeness, turning it into something hidden rather than shared. Privacy was rare. Homes were small. Beds were shared. Families slept in the same rooms. Yet emotional privacy was even rarer than physical privacy. Intimate moments had to be quiet, quick, and carefully hidden within daily life. There were no private spaces designed for closeness. Instead, intimacy happened in moments taken from routine, often without comfort or safety. This lack of privacy did not make intimacy romantic or exciting. It often made it awkward, tense, and emotionally distant. Religion played a strong role in keeping intimacy quiet and controlled. The church taught that desire should be restrained, and that physical closeness existed mainly for marriage and children. Pleasure was rarely discussed and often viewed with suspicion. Because of this, many people learned to separate physical closeness from emotional warmth. Intimacy became something done, not something talked about. Feelings were rarely shared. Experiences were rarely reflected on. Everything remained unspoken, carried silently inside the mind. For women especially, this silence was heavy. They were expected to obey, to endure, and to remain modest and quiet about their experiences. Their thoughts and feelings were rarely considered important. Men, too, lived inside this silence, often unsure of expectations and afraid of moral failure. Both lived with limited understanding, shaped more by rules and fear than by communication or care. Over time, this created a culture where intimacy was deeply private, but not deeply understood. People did not lack closeness, but they lacked language. They lacked guidance. They lacked reassurance. Intimacy existed, but it often felt confusing rather than comforting. This quiet confusion became normal, passed from one generation to the next without explanation. As you imagine this world of silence, notice how calm and heavy it feels. Nothing dramatic happens. Nothing is loudly wrong. Yet so much is missing. This is an important part of understanding what intimacy was really like in medieval times. Not wild or open, but quiet, restricted, and deeply shaped by what could never be said. As the night grows quieter now, let these thoughts soften and fade. Let the mind rest without needing answers. Let stillness remain gentle and unforced. In medieval times, one of the most important things to understand is how little people spoke openly about private life. Silence was not empty. Silence was normal. Most knowledge about intimacy was never discussed out loud, never explained clearly, and never written in simple words. People learned by watching life slowly, by listening to hints, and by observing what was expected of them. There were no open conversations, no guidance meant to bring comfort or understanding. Instead, there was quiet instruction through tradition, routine, and duty. This made many parts of life feel confusing, especially for young people entering adulthood. Privacy itself was very different from what we imagine today. Homes were small, rooms were shared, families often lived together in one or two spaces. Curtains, walls, and closed doors were rare. Because of this, privacy did not come from isolation, but from timing and habit. People learned when to look away, when to stay silent, and when not to ask questions. This unspoken agreement created a strange balance where private life existed in the open, yet was never openly acknowledged. Everyone knew, but no one spoke. For many married couples, intimacy was not about expression or emotion, but about responsibility. It was tied closely to marriage, family continuation, and social duty. Feelings were secondary. Comfort was rare. Understanding was limited. This did not mean people felt nothing. It meant feelings were kept quiet and private, carried inward rather than shared. Love, when it existed, grew slowly through shared work, shared hardship, and time, not through words or romantic gestures. Religious belief shaped this silence even more. Many people were taught that too much interest in the body was dangerous to the soul. Curiosity was often discouraged. Questions were avoided. This created a life where natural human experiences were accepted as part of duty, but rarely explored as part of joy. People lived with this contradiction quietly, without naming it. As the night grows quieter, imagine this world of unspoken understanding. A world where life moves forward without explanation, where people adapt without guidance, where silence carries meaning, and routine replaces discussion. This quiet, restrained way of living shaped how medieval people experienced intimacy, not through choice but through tradition and expectation. Let the image soften now. Let the quiet remain gentle. Allow rest to continue naturally, without effort. Imagine now how little privacy existed in medieval life, and how deeply that shaped intimate relationships. Most people lived in small homes with shared rooms. Families slept together. Servants slept nearby. Even animals were sometimes kept inside during cold nights. Because of this, private moments were rare, quiet, and carefully timed. Intimacy was not loud or expressive. It happened softly, often in darkness, often in silence. This lack of privacy did not mean intimacy was less meaningful. In many ways, it made it more careful, more restrained, and more inward. Physical closeness in medieval times was closely tied to trust rather than pleasure alone. Marriage created a space where intimacy was allowed, but even within marriage, it was shaped by duty, rhythm, and expectation. Many couples shared intimacy as part of ordinary life, not as a dramatic or emotional event. It was something woven into daily routine, much like eating or sleeping. This made it less romantic by modern standards, but also less performative. There was no audience, no comparison, no outside influence. What happened stayed between two people, quiet and contained. Because language around intimacy was limited, much was understood through habit rather than conversation. People rarely spoke openly about desire. Instead, they followed cultural signals and shared understanding. Touch was gentle and familiar. The body was not explored in the way modern culture often presents it. Instead, closeness was simple and repetitive, shaped by familiarity rather than curiosity. This simplicity created a sense of stability, even if it lacked excitement. Religion continued to influence these moments deeply. Many people believed that intimacy should be calm, restrained, and purposeful. Strong emotion was often seen as dangerous, capable of leading the soul away from balance. Because of this, moderation was encouraged. Even pleasure, when acknowledged, was expected to remain quiet and controlled. This created an atmosphere where intimacy was inward, reflective, and emotionally contained. As you imagine these moments, notice how different they feel from modern ideas. There is no rush here, no urgency, no performance. Just two people sharing space in a quiet world, shaped by routine, belief, and silence. This is an important part of understanding what intimacy really felt like in medieval times. It was not dramatic, it was subtle. It was part of life's slow rhythm. As the night grows quieter now, let this image soften and fade. You do not need to hold on to it. Let your body remain still. Let your breathing stay slow and natural. Allow rest to continue gently, without effort, as we move slowly toward the final understanding of this past world. Imagine now the quiet moments that followed everything people were taught, told, and expected to do. In medieval times, intimacy was rarely spoken about openly, even between married partners. Words for desire, pleasure, or curiosity were often missing from daily language. Instead, silence filled the space where conversation might exist today. Many couples entered marriage without ever discussing what closeness meant to them as individuals. Expectations were learned from religion, tradition, and observation, not from open guidance. This silence shaped how intimacy felt, often making it something performed out of duty rather than shared understanding. For many women especially, intimacy was closely tied to responsibility. Marriage brought expectations of obedience, childbearing, and household order. Emotional comfort was rarely discussed as part of closeness. Pleasure was not considered essential, and sometimes not considered appropriate at all. Because of this, many women learned to approach intimacy quietly, without asking questions, and without expecting personal fulfillment. This did not always mean unhappiness, but it did mean acceptance of a narrow role shaped by society rather than personal choice. Men too lived within limits, though they were different ones. Masculinity was tied to control, strength, and restraint. Openly expressing vulnerability or emotional need was discouraged. Intimacy was often seen as a natural urge that needed discipline, not exploration. This created distance even within marriage. Partners shared a life, a home, and children, but emotional closeness developed slowly, if at all. Love, when it grew, often came later, built quietly over years rather than sparked by early passion. Religious teachings added another layer of quiet pressure. Many believed that desire needed to be controlled to protect the soul. Certain days were forbidden for intimacy. Certain thoughts were discouraged. This created a constant awareness of rules, even in private moments. As a result, intimacy was often careful and restrained, shaped more by fear of wrongdoing than by connection. For some couples, this brought structure and comfort. For others, it brought confusion and distance. Over time, routines replaced curiosity. Intimacy became predictable, scheduled around seasons, health, and duty. This predictability could feel calming, but it could also feel empty. Without open conversation or shared exploration, many couples simply accepted what was normal and did not imagine alternatives. Life moved forward, shaped by repetition rather than reflection. As you imagine these quiet medieval homes, lit softly by candles, Notice how still everything feels. There is no drama here, no loud conflict, just lives shaped by silence, belief, and habit. This is an important part of understanding what intimacy was really like in medieval times. It was not defined by passion or freedom, but by structure, restraint, and quiet endurance. As the night grows calm again, allow these thoughts to soften. You do not need to judge or analyze them further. Let your breathing slow naturally. Let your body rest comfortably where it is. And allow the story to continue gently, in its own time. By the later medieval period, one of the most important things to understand is how little people openly talked about intimacy. Silence itself shaped experience. Most men and women entered marriage with very little clear knowledge, not because they were careless, but because speaking openly about such matters was discouraged. Families avoided the topic. Churches warned against curiosity. Communities relied on tradition rather than explanation. As a result, much of what people knew came from observation, rumor, or brief advice passed quietly from older relatives. This lack of open discussion created confusion, anxiety, and misunderstanding, especially for young couples entering marriage for the first time. Marriage was expected to provide structure and order, not pleasure or emotional closeness. Intimacy was framed as a duty tied to reproduction and social stability. Love might grow later, but it was not required at the beginning. This mindset shaped how people approached closeness. Feelings were secondary to obligation. Silence around personal experience made it difficult to express discomfort, fear, or questions. Many simply accepted what happened as something to endure rather than understand. Religious teachings reinforced this quiet approach. Church guidance focused more on limits than explanations. What should not happen was discussed far more than what could. This created a narrow understanding shaped by rules rather than knowledge. People learned what was forbidden long before they learned what was normal. Because of this, many carried unnecessary guilt or worry, even within marriage. The emotional weight of these beliefs often stayed with people throughout their lives. Daily life offered little privacy as well. Homes were small. Families shared sleeping spaces. Personal moments were limited and easily interrupted. This constant closeness of others made intimacy feel less personal and more routine. There was little space for reflection or emotional connection. Life moved around work, survival, and duty. Quiet moments were rare, and when they came, they passed quickly. As you imagine this world, notice how much was shaped not by action but by absence. Absence of words, absence of choice, absence of understanding. This silence defined experience just as strongly as rules did. It shaped expectations, emotions, and memories in subtle ways that lasted for generations. As the night grows calm again, let these thoughts soften. There is nothing to hold on to here. Just allow the story to drift gently, like a distant memory, becoming quieter with each breath. Let rest continue in its own time, gently, without effort. In medieval times, one of the hardest parts of intimate life was not emotion or belief, but the simple lack of privacy. Homes were small, often shared with many people, sometimes even animals. Families slept in the same rooms. Servants lived close to their employers. Walls were thin and sound traveled easily. Because of this, quietness became more important than expression. Intimacy was something done carefully, slowly, and often without words. Silence was not awkward. It was necessary. Many couples learned to communicate without speaking at all, using routine, timing, and understanding built over years rather than passion shown openly. This lack of privacy shaped behavior deeply. There was little space for experimentation or spontaneity. Most intimate moments happened at night, when others were asleep, or during rare moments of being alone. Even then, people remained aware of their surroundings. This constant awareness made intimacy feel restrained and controlled, not because of shame alone, but because the environment demanded it. Over time, people adjusted. Desire became quieter. Expression became simpler. Intimacy blended into daily life rather than standing apart from it. Because privacy was rare, emotional closeness often mattered more than physical display. Long marriages were built on shared hardship, routine, and mutual dependence. Touch was subtle. Affection was shown through care rather than passion, helping with work, sharing food, protecting one another from illness or hardship. These acts carried meaning that replaced what modern people might expect from romantic expression. Love existed, but it moved slowly and quietly, shaped by survival rather than fantasy. As you imagine this world, notice how calm and restrained it feels. There is no drama here, no excess. Just people adapting to their surroundings, finding closeness in small, careful ways. This is an important part of understanding intimacy in medieval times. It was not loud or expressive. It was practical, quiet, and deeply shaped by the reality of everyday life. As the night grows quiet again, allow this image to soften. Let it fade gently. Let your breathing stay slow and natural. Rest can continue, calmly and without effort, as this story moves forward. As we gently move deeper into medieval life, it becomes clear that intimacy was shaped more by silence and circumstance than by open choice or comfort. Privacy was rare. Most people lived in small homes with shared rooms, thin walls, and little separation between daily life and nightlife. Beds were often shared not only by couples, but sometimes by children or other family members as well. Because of this, closeness happened quietly, carefully, and often without words. There was no clear boundary between public and private space. Everything happened within hearing distance of others, which shaped behavior into something restrained and modest on the surface. Emotions were rarely spoken out loud. Feelings were not discussed openly, especially between men and women. Many learned about closeness through observation rather than instruction. Knowledge was passed quietly, often indirectly, through stories, religious guidance, or older women in the household. Curiosity existed, but it was controlled by custom and expectation. Intimacy was not presented as something personal or expressive. It was seen as part of life's order, tied to marriage, duty, and family continuation rather than pleasure or emotional bonding. Because of these limits, much of intimacy existed in the mind rather than in action. Small gestures held meaning. A glance, sitting close, sharing warmth in cold rooms. These moments carried weight because larger expressions were restricted. This created a slow, quiet closeness that fit the pace of medieval life. Nothing was rushed. Everything followed rhythm, routine, and accepted roles. As you imagine this quiet world, notice how different it feels from modern ideas. There is no openness, no discussion, no clear separation between daily labor and night rest. Intimacy blends into ordinary life, shaped by silence and habit. This is another reason medieval life felt heavy and restrained. Even the most personal moments were controlled by space, custom, and expectation. As the night grows calm once more, allow this image to soften and drift away. Let your body remain still. Let your breathing stay slow and natural. Rest does not need effort. It arrives gently, in its own time. By this stage of medieval life, one of the most important things to understand is how little privacy existed around intimacy. Most people lived in small homes with shared spaces, often sleeping in the same room as children, relatives, or servants. Because of this, sexual life was quiet, careful, and often rushed. There was no concept of privacy as we know it today. Beds were shared. Curtains were rare. Walls were thin or non-existent. This meant that intimacy had to fit into the rhythms of daily life, rather than standing apart from it. Nighttime, when others slept more deeply, became the most common time, not because of romance, but because of silence. Sex was not surrounded by constant conversation or explanation. People did not talk openly about desire or technique. Knowledge was passed quietly, often through observation or short advice from older women or married relatives. Many entered marriage with very limited understanding of what to expect. This lack of information made intimacy feel confusing rather than exciting. It was something to learn slowly, without guidance, and often without comfort. Mistakes were common, but rarely discussed. For many couples, sex became routine rather than emotional. It was something done because it was expected, not because it was deeply explored. Pleasure was not ignored completely, but it was secondary to duty, fertility, and social order. Emotional closeness came more from shared hardship, shared work, and shared survival than from intimacy itself. In this way, sex blended into everyday life, becoming ordinary rather than dramatic. Religious ideas continued to shape behavior even in private moments. Guilt, modesty, and restraint followed people into the bedroom. Certain days were avoided. Certain behaviors were discouraged. Even within marriage, people were taught to be controlled and moderate. This did not mean intimacy disappeared, but it did mean it was surrounded by quiet rules that limited freedom and expression. As you imagine this world, notice how simple and restrained it feels. There is no noise, no display, no performance. Just quiet human closeness happening in small spaces, shaped by custom, belief, and necessity. This is what sex was often like in medieval times. Not dramatic, not romanticized, but ordinary, private, and deeply woven into the structure of daily life. As the night grows calmer now, allow this image to soften and fade. You do not need to hold on to it. Let the mind rest gently. Let the body remain still. Allow sleep to continue naturally, without effort. As medieval life moved quietly through seasons and years, intimacy for most people settled into something far less dramatic than stories might suggest. For married couples, closeness was often shaped more by duty and routine than by romance or passion. Marriage itself was rarely about love. It was about family ties, land, survival, and social order. Because of this, physical closeness became another responsibility, approached calmly and without much discussion. It was not something openly spoken about, shared with friends, or explored freely. Instead, it existed quietly behind closed doors, surrounded by silence rather than conversation. For many women especially, this part of life was guided by expectation rather than choice. From a young age, they were taught what was required of them, not what they might want or feel. There was little space to question or reflect. Intimacy became something that happened because it was expected, not because it was desired. This created a quiet emotional distance where feelings were often set aside in favor of duty. Men, too, lived within strict rules, shaped by religion and social pressure. Expression was limited. Curiosity was discouraged. Everything was meant to stay controlled, modest, and unseen. Religion played a constant role in shaping these moments. Many believed that physical closeness should only happen under very specific conditions. Certain days were forbidden. Certain times were discouraged. Too much closeness was thought to weaken the soul or distract from spiritual life. Because of this, intimacy carried a quiet sense of caution. It was approached carefully, sometimes with guilt, sometimes with confusion. Pleasure was rarely discussed openly, and understanding was limited. What people knew came from tradition, whispered advice, or simple experience over time. Over the years, this created a very different emotional landscape from what we imagine today. Intimacy was not a source of excitement or exploration. It was part of life's structure, like work or prayer. Some found comfort in its familiarity. Others felt only obligation. Most simply accepted it as another quiet element of daily existence. There were no guides, no open conversations, and no shared language for feelings. Everything stayed internal, private, and largely unexamined. As you imagine this calm, restrained world, notice how quiet it feels. There is no drama here, no strong emotion, only routine shaped by belief and expectation. This was the reality for many people living in medieval times. Not mystery or fantasy, but a simple, structured part of life, carried quietly from one day to the next. As the night grows still once more, allow these thoughts to soften and fade. You do not need to hold on to them. Let your breathing remain slow. Let your body stay relaxed. Allow rest to continue gently, in its own time. By the time we reach this part of medieval life, it becomes clear that one of the most powerful forces shaping intimacy was silence. Sex in medieval times was not openly discussed, explained, or guided in the way modern people might expect. There were no books meant to teach pleasure, no open conversations between parents and children, and no shared language for desire. Most people entered marriage with very little understanding of their own bodies or the bodies of their partners. What they learned came slowly, quietly, and often through confusion rather than clarity. This lack of knowledge did not feel dramatic to them. It simply felt normal because nothing else was known. Privacy was rare, homes were small, beds were shared, families lived close together, servants slept nearby, animals were often indoors at night. Because of this, intimate moments were brief and carefully timed. Silence mattered. Movements were restrained. Emotional expression was limited. Intimacy was something that happened quietly, without words, without explanation, and without reflection afterward. There was little space to explore feelings or to talk about satisfaction or discomfort. What happened simply happened, and life moved on. This silence also meant that many people carried private worries they could never voice. Pain, fear, confusion, or disappointment had no place to go. Religious teaching emphasized restraint and duty, not mutual understanding. Pleasure, especially for women, was rarely discussed in any supportive way. When pleasure existed, it was personal and unspoken. When it did not, that absence was also unspoken. Over time, this created a quiet emotional distance within many marriages, not from cruelty, but from lack of language and understanding. As you imagine this quiet world, notice how different it feels from modern expectations. Intimacy existed, but it was shaped by silence rather than expression, by habit rather than choice, and by duty rather than exploration. This is an important part of understanding what sex was really like in medieval times. It was not constant passion or constant misery. It was something quieter, simpler, and far more limited by the world around it. As the night grows still again, allow this image of quiet medieval homes and unspoken lives to soften and fade. Let your body remain relaxed. Let your breathing stay slow and gentle. Allow rest to continue calmly, without effort. In medieval times, one of the hardest parts of intimate life was not desire, but the complete lack of privacy. Most people lived in small homes with one main room. Families slept, ate, worked, and rested in the same space. Beds were shared, sometimes by many people, and walls were thin or missing altogether. This meant that private moments had to be quiet, quick, and carefully timed. Intimacy was not surrounded by comfort or secrecy. It happened softly, often in darkness, with the constant awareness that others were nearby. This shaped how people thought about closeness. It was less about romance and more about routine, duty, and shared life. Nighttime offered the only real chance for privacy, but even then, silence was important. Candles were expensive, so darkness covered most homes. This darkness created a quiet space, but it also limited comfort. There were no private rooms designed for closeness. No soft beds made for relaxation. Straw mattresses, rough blankets, and cold air were common. Because of this, intimacy was often brief and practical. Emotional connection existed, but it was expressed through daily support rather than spoken words or gestures. Church teachings also shaped how people felt during these moments. Many carried quiet guilt or confusion, even within marriage. Pleasure was rarely discussed openly. Instead, people focused on responsibility and family life. This did not mean affection was absent. It simply looked different. A gentle touch during daily work, shared warmth during sleep, or quiet companionship by the fire often mattered more than physical closeness itself. As you imagine this world, notice how calm and simple it feels even with its limits. Life moved slowly. People adapted to shared spaces and learned to find closeness in small, quiet ways. This is an important part of understanding intimacy in medieval times. It was shaped by space, belief, and daily survival, not by comfort or privacy. As the night grows quieter now, allow this image to soften. Let the idea fade gently. You do not need to hold on to it. Let your body remain still. Let your breathing stay slow and easy. Rest can continue naturally, without effort, as history drifts quietly into sleep. By this point in medieval life, intimacy had become something very ordinary and very quiet. It was no longer surrounded by curiosity or excitement, but shaped instead by routine and expectation. For most couples, intimacy happened not because of desire, but because it was part of life's rhythm, like eating, working, or sleeping. There was little discussion about it, almost no language to describe feelings, and no space to explore emotions openly. What happened between two people remained unspoken, even between them. Silence was not awkward, it was normal. Most medieval people did not think of intimacy as a personal experience. It was seen as a duty within marriage, something tied to order, family, and continuation of life. Pleasure was rarely discussed, and often ignored entirely. Many people likely never questioned whether intimacy could feel different, gentler, or more meaningful. They simply accepted what they were taught by custom, religion, and observation. This acceptance created a calm but limited understanding of the body and its needs. Living spaces also shaped this experience. Homes were crowded. Privacy was rare. Sounds of daily life never fully stopped. Because of this, intimacy was quiet, careful, and often rushed. There was no soft preparation, no long moments of connection. It fit into the day wherever space allowed. This lack of privacy made intimacy feel practical rather than emotional, something done carefully so as not to be noticed. As years passed, intimacy often became less frequent, not because of age alone, but because exhaustion took over. Medieval life was physically demanding. Long hours of labor, poor sleep, illness, and hunger drained energy. At the end of the day, most people simply wanted rest. The body asked for stillness more than closeness. Intimacy, when it happened, was brief and quiet, followed quickly by sleep. For women especially, intimacy carried worry. Pregnancy was dangerous. Childbirth was uncertain. There was little medical help. This fear lived quietly in the background, shaping how intimacy was felt. Even without words, the body remembered risk. This made intimacy something approached with caution rather than comfort. For men, expectations were heavy in a different way. Masculinity was tied to duty, strength, and control. Emotions were rarely expressed. Vulnerability had no place. This made intimacy emotionally distant, even when bodies were close. Connection existed, but it was muted and restrained. As you imagine this stage of medieval life, notice how calm and uneventful it feels. There is no drama here, no strong emotion, only routine. This is the truth of medieval intimacy for most people. It was not scandalous or exciting. It was quiet, limited, and deeply shaped by the structure of life itself. As the night grows quieter now, let this image soften. You do not need to hold on to it. Let your body remain still. Let your breathing slow naturally. Allow rest to continue gently, without effort, in its own time. Imagine living in a medieval home where privacy, as we understand it today, simply did not exist. Houses were small, often made of wood or stone, with one main room where most of life happened. Families slept together, sometimes parents, children, and even servants in the same space. Beds were shared, not out of romance, but out of necessity and warmth. In such a setting, intimate moments were shaped by circumstance rather than comfort. Silence, timing, and routine mattered more than passion. People learned to move carefully through these moments, fitting them quietly into daily life rather than separating them from it. Because private rooms were rare, intimacy often happened at night when the house finally grew still. Darkness provided cover, and exhaustion softened awareness. These moments were usually brief and practical, not extended or expressive. Medieval life was physically demanding, and by the time night arrived, most bodies were tired. Intimacy was less about pleasure as an experience and more about connection, duty, or continuation of family life. This does not mean affection did not exist, but it was expressed differently in small gestures rather than open displays. Social rules also shaped how intimacy was viewed. Public behavior was closely watched, especially in small communities where everyone knew each other. Reputation mattered deeply. Because of this, private life stayed truly private, spoken about rarely and carefully. Knowledge about bodies and relationships was passed quietly, often from older women to younger ones or through observation rather than explanation. Many people entered marriage with limited understanding, learning slowly through experience rather than instruction. As you imagine these quiet moments unfolding in the dark, notice how different they feel from modern ideas. There is no emphasis on performance or exploration. There is only closeness shaped by routine, belief, and environment. This is an important part of understanding medieval intimacy. It was not hidden because it was shameful, but because life itself allowed little space for separation between public and private. As the night grows calm once more, allow this image to soften and drift away. Let the past remain where it belongs, quiet and distant. Let your breathing stay slow and natural, and allow rest to continue gently, without effort or expectation. As the medieval world slowly moved toward its later centuries, one thing remained deeply unchanged. Most intimate life was still lived in silence. People did not talk openly about private matters, even within families. There were no guides, no clear conversations, and no shared understanding passed gently from one generation to the next. Knowledge came through observation, rumor, and quiet instruction, often incomplete and confusing. This silence shaped expectations, emotions, and experiences in ways that lasted a lifetime. For many, intimacy was closely tied to duty rather than desire. Marriage was a responsibility, not a romantic goal. Expectations were shaped by religion, tradition, and community pressure. Pleasure was rarely discussed, and emotional connection was not considered necessary. This made private life feel mechanical rather than personal. Many people entered adulthood without understanding their own bodies or emotions, and this lack of understanding often followed them throughout life. Women especially carried a heavy burden of expectation and silence. Their role was clearly defined, yet rarely explained. They were expected to know what to do without being taught. Questions were discouraged. Curiosity was often labeled as improper. This created fear, confusion, and emotional distance. Even in long marriages, communication about private life remained limited, leaving many feeling alone even when not physically alone. Men, too, lived under strict expectations. Strength, control, and restraint were valued more than understanding or emotional openness. Showing vulnerability was discouraged. Confusion or uncertainty was hidden. This pressure created its own quiet struggle, where many followed rules without fully understanding their purpose. Emotional closeness was rare, not because it was unwanted, but because it was never modeled. Over time, this silence shaped entire communities. Intimacy became something private to the point of isolation. There were no shared stories, no reassurance, no normalizing of experience. Each person assumed their confusion or discomfort was unique. This made private life feel heavy and lonely, even when it was considered normal by society. As you imagine this unspoken world, notice how quiet it feels. There is no drama here, no loud conflict. Just generations of people moving through life without words for deeply human experiences. This is one of the most important truths about medieval intimacy. It was not loud or open. It was quiet, restrained, and often misunderstood. As the night grows deeper now, allow this final image to soften and fade. You do not need to hold on to it. Let your body remain still. Let your breathing slow naturally. Let rest continue gently, without effort, without thought, in its own calm time. As we reach the quiet end of this long journey, it becomes clear that intimacy in medieval times was less about pleasure and more about duty, belief, and survival. Life moved slowly then, guided by seasons, religion, and community rules. Private moments were shaped by shared rooms, simple homes, and the constant presence of others. There was little privacy, little knowledge, and very few choices. What people understood about the body came from tradition and belief, not science. And yet, within these limits, human closeness still existed in quiet, ordinary ways, woven gently into daily life. Marriage was the main space where intimacy was expected, not openly discussed, but quietly assumed. Love, when it appeared, grew slowly over time rather than beginning with passion. Many couples learned closeness through shared work, shared hardship, and shared years. Intimacy was not something separate from life. It was part of it, shaped by routine and responsibility. In this world, expectations were simple, and emotions were often kept inside, expressed more through action than words. Religion remained a constant presence, guiding behavior and shaping how people felt about desire. Guilt and restraint were common, but so was acceptance of human nature, even if it was rarely spoken about openly. People lived with contradictions, balancing belief with instinct, duty with feeling. This balance was not dramatic. It was quiet and ordinary, lived day by day. As we look back calmly, without judgment, we see lives that were very different from our own, yet still deeply human. People sought connection, comfort, and understanding in the ways available to them. They lived without modern knowledge, without privacy, and without choice. Yet they continued forward, guided by tradition and necessity. Now, as the night grows still, allow this history to rest gently in the past. There is nothing more to analyze, nothing more to hold on to. Let the story soften and fade, like a candle slowly dimming. Your body can remain still. Your breathing can stay slow and natural. The world of medieval times can drift away, leaving only calm behind. For now, remain at ease. Let the quiet deepen. Let rest continue in its own time. Good night.